The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of the auctioneer's table, and Pauline Bell felt the sound like a slap across the face. "Sold," said Harlan Voss, the self-appointed land commissioner of Caldwell, Kansas, his yellow teeth gleaming beneath his thick mustache. "To Mr. Gerald Prout, for the sum of $420. The Bell homestead parcel, 160 acres along the Cimarron River, is now the lawful property of the Prout Cattle Company." Pauline stepped forward from the crowd, her boots grinding into the sun-hardened dirt of the main street, her leather satchel gripped so tightly in her fist that her knuckles had gone white. She had ridden 14 hours on a borrowed horse to get here. She had the documents. She had the survey papers her father had filed in 1878 before the fever took him. She had proof. "That land belongs to my family," she said, loud enough that the 60-odd people gathered on the street went quiet. "Those papers were fraudulently voided. I have the original deed right here." Harlan Voss looked at her the way a man looks at a fly landing on his Sunday hat. He did not even glance at the satchel. "Little lady," he said, and the words carried a particular kind of contempt that only a man who had never once questioned his own authority could produce. "The courts of Sumner County have ruled. The deed was declared invalid on account of unpaid survey fees dating back to 1877. You have no standing here." "I paid those fees," Pauline said. "3 weeks ago, in person. I have the receipt." The crowd murmured, some in sympathy, most in discomfort. Several men looked away. Gerald Prout, fat and satisfied in his cream-colored linen suit, was already shaking Voss's hand. "Then you should have been here 3 weeks ago," Voss said, snapping his ledger shut. "The auction was lawful and final. That was when it happened." That was when Pauline Bell stood in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, holding legal proof of her family's land in her bare hands, watching a corrupt man laugh at her, and understood completely what everyone back east had tried to warn her about. Not just Harlan Voss, not just the crooked land commissioner's office. Every single person she had ever loved had sat her down and told her the same thing. The West would swallow her whole. She was a woman alone. She was 26 years old. She had no husband, no brother, no man of any kind standing beside her. And in the eyes of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1882, that meant she had nothing at all. She turned and walked away from the crowd before they could see her cry. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much. The story of how Pauline Bell arrived in Caldwell began 8 months earlier, in the raw, gray November of 1881, in a cramped apartment above a glovemaker's shop in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had been living since her mother died and left her with $32, a steamer trunk, and a letter from her father's old business partner, explaining that the Bell homestead in Kansas had been transferred into disputed ownership. Pauline had been working as a copyist for a legal firm at the time, a job she had secured by presenting herself as a widow, because no law firm in Cincinnati would hire a single woman of 25 to do skilled work without that particular fiction. She could read Latin. She could parse a contract faster than most of the young men who called themselves lawyers. She had spent 4 years watching judges and clerks from behind a desk stacked with papers, and she had learned everything worth learning about how property law worked, at least in theory. In practice, she quickly discovered, property law worked exactly as well as the nearest man with money wanted it to. Her father, Clement Bell, had homesteaded in Kansas under the Homestead Act of 1862, one of the thousands of settlers who had moved west with the genuine belief that hard work and legal claim would be enough. He had built a house. He had broken the land. He had planted wheat and fought drought and buried a son who died of cholera in the summer of 1874. He had filed every paper the government required. He had paid every fee. And when he died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1879, he had believed, truly believed, that the 160 acres along the Cimarron River would pass cleanly to his daughter. What he had not accounted for was Harlan Voss, who had arrived in Sumner County in 1880 with a satchel full of blank land certificates, a handshake deal with the county clerk, and the practiced smile of a man who had done exactly this kind of thing before. Pauline had spent the better part of a year writing letters. She had written to the county clerk, to the district land office, to the territorial representative in Topeka, to 2 senators and 1 congressman whose names she had found in a newspaper. She had received 4 form letters, 2 polite non-replies, and 1 honest response from a junior clerk in Topeka who told her, off the record, that Harlan Voss had connections that ran deep into the county administration, and that she would need to appear in person if she had any hope of making her case. So she had done something everyone told her not to do. She had gone west. She had packed the steamer trunk, booked a seat on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, and left Cincinnati on a cold January morning in 1882 with her savings, her documents, and the particular kind of stubbornness that had always been simultaneously her greatest strength and the source of every hard word anyone had ever said about her. The train ride took 3 days. She arrived in Caldwell in a snowstorm, with a leather satchel full of legal papers and the address of a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Edna Cartwright, who had been recommended to her by the junior clerk in Topeka as someone who could be trusted. Mrs. Cartwright was 61 years old, built like a post-oak tree, and had the manner of a woman who had seen enough of the world's foolishness to be unsurprised by any of it. She looked Pauline over the way you might examine a horse before buying it, not unkindly but without sentimentality. "You're here about the Bell land," Mrs. Cartwright said. It was not a question. "News travels," Pauline said. "In Caldwell, news travels the way fire travels through dry grass," Mrs. Cartwright said. "Come inside. I'll put on coffee. You'll need it." The boarding house had 6 rooms upstairs, a parlor that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and a kitchen table large enough to seat 12. 3 of the boarders were traveling salesmen. One was a school teacher named Mr. Aldous, and one was a man Pauline noticed right away, not because he was particularly loud or dramatic about his presence, but because of the exact opposite reason. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Mrs. Cartwright brought Pauline in, reading a survey map with the focused attention of a man who had forgotten the rest of the world existed. He was broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 2 days of dark stubble. He wore a plain gray wool shirt and practical boots. No gun belt, which was unusual. When he looked up, Pauline saw that his eyes were dark brown and very steady. "Miss Bell," Mrs. Cartwright said, "this is Andrew Dawson. He surveys for the district land office out of Wichita. Andrew, this is Pauline Bell. She's come about her father's homestead." Andrew Dawson put the survey map down flat on the table and stood. He was taller than she had guessed from the sitting position. He extended his hand the way you would to another professional, not tentatively, not with the condescending performance of helpfulness that many men offered women they considered to be in trouble. "Miss Bell," he said, "I've heard about your case." "Most people in this town have," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and brief and honest. "Most people in this town have an opinion about it too," he said. "For what it's worth, the survey numbers on your father's original filing are correct. I looked at them when the dispute first came up." She stared at him. "You looked at my father's survey numbers. It's my job to care about accurate surveys," he said, without any drama about it. "Voss's people filed a corrected survey in 1880 that moved the boundary markers 6 degrees. It's a small adjustment on paper. It's significant on the ground." Pauline sat down at the table without being invited. She pulled the satchel open and drew out the survey documents she had brought from Cincinnati. "Show me," she said. He sat back down across from her. Mrs. Cartwright set 2 cups of coffee between them and left them alone with the quiet respect of a woman who understood when something important was happening. They sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours. Andrew Dawson was, Pauline discovered, exactly what he appeared to be. He was 30 years old, a trained surveyor who had been working for the General Land Office since 1876, first in Nebraska, then in Kansas. He had a methodical, precise mind and the unusual quality, in her experience, of listening completely when someone else was speaking. He did not interrupt. He did not finish her sentences. He looked at her documents with genuine, careful attention, and when he spoke about what he actually saw in front of him rather than what he expected to find. "This receipt," he said, holding the survey fee payment she had made 3 weeks before the auction. "Where did you file this?" "The county clerk's office. In person, I have the duplicate copy." He nodded slowly. "Voss will say the filing was incomplete. He'll point to a procedural technicality. That's his pattern." "His pattern," Pauline repeated. "Has he done this before?" Andrew set the document down carefully. "3 times that I know of. 2 families took the settlement Prout offered them and left. The third tried to fight it through the courts and ran out of money before the case concluded." "How do you know all this?" He met her eyes. "Because I filed a formal complaint with the district land office in Wichita 8 months ago, about Voss's boundary adjustments, about the pattern of disputed auctions, about the relationship between Voss and Gerald Prout." He paused. "Nothing happened." "Nothing happened," she said. "My supervisor told me to let it go. He has a ranch near Prout's operation and they shoot quail together on Sundays." Andrew said this without bitterness, just with the flat accuracy of a man reporting a fact. "That's the West, Miss Bell. The law exists on paper. On the ground, it often belongs to whoever has the most money and the fewest scruples." Pauline looked at this man for a long moment. She thought about all the people who had told her not to come. She thought about her mother saying, "Pauline, what do you expect to do about it? You're a woman. Let it go." She thought about the lawyer in Cincinnati who had told her she had a strong case and then billed her for the consultation and declined to take the matter further. "I'm not letting it go," she said. "I know," Andrew said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard directed at her in a very long time. Not pity, not impatience, not the careful condescension of a man managing a difficult woman. It was simply, plainly belief. "I figured that out in the first 10 minutes. She looked back at the papers. "Then help me." He was quiet for a moment. "I already decided to," he said. Over the weeks that followed, Pauline Bell became a fixture at the Sumner County Land Records office in a way that made the clerks deeply uncomfortable. She arrived when it opened and left when it closed. She requested every document pertaining to her father's original filing, every subsequent filing by the Prout Cattle Company, every survey record touching land within a 3-mile radius of the Bell homestead along the Cimarron River. She copied them by hand when she was not allowed to remove the originals. She cataloged them in a system of cross-referenced folders that she built herself from pasteboard and twine. The head clerk, a nervous young man named Otis, tried on 3 separate occasions to refuse her access to documents that were public record. On each of those occasions, Pauline calmly cited the specific provision of the General Land Office regulations that required those documents to be available for inspection. She had memorized the relevant sections on the train ride from Cincinnati. After the 3rd time, Otis stopped refusing and simply watched her with something that might have been grudging respect. Andrew Dawson, meanwhile, used his position with the land office to request a formal resurvey of the disputed boundary. It was within his authority to do so, technically, though he was well aware his supervisor in Wichita would not be pleased. He rode out to the Cimarron River parcel on a cold February morning with his equipment and spent 2 full days measuring and recording. What he found confirmed what he had suspected from the original documents. The boundary markers on the 1880 Prout survey had been physically moved, not by much, just enough to shift the recorded property line 40 yards to the south and exclude the crucial water access that made the land valuable for cattle grazing. Someone had done it deliberately and carefully, the kind of adjustment that would be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. He wrote his findings in a formal report and sent a copy to Wichita. He gave another copy to Pauline. She read it at the kitchen table in Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house on a Tuesday evening with Andrew sitting across from her drinking coffee, and when she finished reading, She looked up with an expression that was equal parts relief and fury. "This is enough," she said. "This should be enough to invalidate the original auction." "It should be," Andrew said carefully. "But it might not be," she said, because she had learned by now to hear what he did not say as clearly as what he did. "The district court in Wichita is the right venue," he said, "but it takes time to get a case on the docket, and in the meantime, Prout will have his lawyers arguing that the resurvey is biased because of my prior complaint against Voss. They'll try to discredit the findings before they're heard." Pauline set the report down. She looked at her hands for a moment. Outside, the February wind was driving grit against the windows of the boarding house. "What would you do," she said, "if it were your land?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I'd go to Topeka," he said, "not to the representative's office, to the General Land Office regional supervisor, the one above my supervisor. I'd bring the resurvey, the original documents, the payment receipt, and I'd make enough noise that it became politically inconvenient to ignore." "That could take months," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm running out of money," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud, and she said it without shame, just as a fact that needed to be part of the calculation. He nodded. He didn't look away from her when she said it, and he didn't adopt the pained expression of a man embarrassed by a woman's financial honesty. He just held her gaze and said, "I know a few people in Topeka, people who have been watching what Voss is doing. A reporter for the Topeka Daily Capital who's been building a story about land fraud in Sumner County for the better part of a year. If you're willing to talk to him, it could create pressure that speeds things along." "You've been building toward this," Pauline said slowly. "Before I arrived, you were already working on this." "I've been gathering what I could," he said. "But I was one person with no personal stake in it who could be reassigned by his supervisor at any time. You have something I don't have." "What's that?" "You have something to lose," he said. "And people understand loss better than they understand principle." She studied him across the table. In the lamplight, his face had the quality of someone who was used to being outdoors, weathered and honest and unguarded in a way that indoor people rarely were. She had trusted very few people in her life with anything that mattered, and she was cautious about starting. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment with evident sincerity. "Because it's wrong," he said. "And because someone ought to." It was not a romantic answer. It was not a declaration or a performance. It was simply what he meant, and for that reason, it was the most reassuring thing anyone had said to her in as long as she could remember. She told him she would go to Topeka. They rode the train together in early March, which created a minor scandal in Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house that Mrs. Cartwright herself dismissed with a single comment: "Two professionals traveling on business. Anyone who thinks otherwise can board elsewhere." Pauline wore her best dress, dark navy wool with a high collar, and the kind of composed expression she had developed over years of entering rooms where she was not expected to be capable of anything useful. Andrew wore a clean suit that he had clearly had for several years and pressed badly. She noticed the pressing issue when they boarded and said nothing about it, and he caught her looking and said, "I know, I'm better with surveying instruments than with a flat iron." "Clearly," she said. "It's a terrible handicap for a man in my position," he said entirely seriously. "Is it?" she said. "In most professional situations, yes," he said, and then unexpectedly he smiled. It transformed his face in a way she had not been prepared for. It made him look younger and warmer and entirely different from the careful, measured man she had been working alongside for 6 weeks. She looked out the window at the Kansas prairie sliding past, brown and flat and enormous under the March sky, and she felt something she had not felt since long before her mother died and the legal fight began, and all of it closed around her like a fist. She felt, very briefly, the strange warmth of being in the company of someone who made the world feel slightly less dangerous than it actually was. She did not examine the feeling. She had too much work to do. The meeting with the reporter, whose name was James Whitfield, took place in a small office on Kansas Avenue in Topeka that smelled of ink and pipe smoke and old coffee. Whitfield was a compact, sharp-eyed man of about 40 who wrote everything down in a small notebook with a pencil he kept sharpened to a dangerous point. He had, as Andrew had suggested, been building his story about Sumner County land fraud for 11 months. When Pauline laid her documents on his desk and explained what had happened, Whitfield read everything twice before saying a word. Then he looked at Andrew. "Your resurvey findings," he said. "You're willing to be named." "I'm willing to be named," Andrew said. "Your supervisor in Wichita will not be happy." "My supervisor in Wichita is already not happy with me," Andrew said. "It doesn't change the accuracy of the survey." Whitfield looked at Pauline. "And you, Miss Bell, you understand that once this story runs, Voss and Prout will look for every way possible to discredit you. They'll say you're a hysterical woman trying to make trouble. They'll dig into your background for anything they can use." "They can dig," Pauline said. "I grew up on that land. My father built the farmhouse with his own hands. My brother is buried on that hillside above the river. There is nothing they can find in my past that will feel like anything compared to that." Whitfield wrote something in his notebook. He looked at Pauline for a long moment with the appraising quality of someone who evaluates credibility for a living. "When did you first suspect the survey had been altered?" he asked, and Pauline told him. She told him everything, calmly and precisely, and with dates and amounts and names, the way she had taught herself to tell the truth about hard things, without decoration, without the quiver in the voice that men tended to interpret as evidence of unreliability rather than as evidence of feeling. She told him about her father, about the papers, about the year of letters that went nowhere, about coming to Caldwell alone on a January train in a snowstorm. Andrew sat beside her throughout. He did not interrupt. He did not add things she had not said or explain things on her behalf. When Whitfield asked him a specific question about the survey methodology, he answered it. Otherwise, he was simply there, and she was aware of him in the way you are aware of something solid and reliable at your back when you are standing in uncertain territory. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When they came out onto Kansas Avenue, the March air was cold and smelled like the river. "He's going to run it," Andrew said. "I know," Pauline said. "It'll take a few weeks. The story won't fix everything. It will create pressure. Pressure is what I need," she said. She stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the sky, which was that particular deep blue that only exists in Kansas in early spring, clear and vast and indifferent. "Andrew, yes. Thank you for this, for all of it." She looked at him. "I know what you're risking with your supervisor." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved his dark hair. "I told you why I'm doing it," he said. "Because it's wrong and someone ought to," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's a very determined reason," she said. "I'm a very determined person," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one either. They took the train back to Caldwell that evening. They sat across from each other in the passenger car as the Kansas dark came down around the train, and the lamp inside turned everything amber. Most of the other passengers fell asleep. Outside, the prairie was invisible, just a black emptiness with occasional far-off lights from farmsteads. People out there in the enormous dark building, something they hoped would last. Pauline watched the lights and thought about her father. About the particular smell of the farmhouse in summer, wood and hay, and the river water that was always a little cold even in August. About the way her brother Thomas used to race her down the hill to the riverbank and always let her win and then pretend he hadn't. About how completely she had intended to come back to that land once her mother was settled, and how life had arranged itself to prevent her, one loss at a time. "Tell me something," she said to Andrew. He looked up from the survey maps he had spread across his lap. "Tell me why you became a surveyor," she said. "Not the professional answer, the real one." He folded the maps carefully and set them aside. "My father was a farmer," he said, "in Illinois. Good land. He worked it hard for 20 years. When I was 12, he lost the farm to a boundary dispute with the neighbor. The neighbor had a lawyer and my father didn't. The survey my father had relied on turned out to have an error that the neighbor's lawyer exploited. He paused. We moved to town. My father worked in a mill until he died. He was a man who needed open land to be alive in any real sense, and without it, something in him just stopped. Pauline was very still. You became a surveyor because of that, she said. I became a surveyor because I decided that lines on a map are some of the most powerful things in the world, and I wanted to be one of the people who drew them honestly, he said. He looked out the dark window. I've been drawing them honestly for 6 years. I've never once regretted it. Not even now, with my supervisor writing irritable letters from Wichita. She looked at his profile against the window, the steady jaw, the dark hair, the quality of certainty he carried without arrogance, as though being certain about the right thing to do was just a normal part of being a person. She thought, carefully and deliberately, about the fact that she found him extraordinarily attractive. She acknowledged this to herself with the same flat honesty she brought to the rest of her assessments. She then set it aside, because she had a land case to win and she could not afford the distraction. The weeks that followed were the hardest stretch of the whole business. The story in the Topeka Daily Capital ran on March 27, 1882. It was not a small piece. Whitfield had done his work thoroughly, and it took up the better part of the front page with the headline "SUMNER County Land Fraud. A pattern of corruption implicates Commissioner Harlan Voss." It named Voss. It named Prout. It cited Andrew's resurvey findings by name. It included Pauline's account of the fraudulent auction and reproduced the payment receipt that Voss had claimed was insufficient. Caldwell erupted. Harlan Voss appeared at Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house the very next morning, accompanied by 2 large men Pauline had not seen before, and demanded to speak with Pauline Bell. Mrs. Cartwright met them at the door with a shotgun resting across her forearm, not raised, just present, and informed Voss that Miss Bell was not receiving visitors of his kind, and that he was welcome to communicate through the mail. Voss left. The 2 large men looked at the shotgun, and then at Mrs. Cartwright, and then left as well. Pauline watched this from the window of the parlor and felt a surge of fierce, complicated gratitude for Mrs. Edna Cartwright that she would not forget for the rest of her life. Gerald Prout's lawyers filed a motion challenging the authenticity of Andrew's resurvey. Andrew's supervisor in Wichita wrote him a formal letter of censure. Andrew wrote back a formal response documenting his methodology and requesting a third-party review. He sent a copy to the district land office in Topeka above his supervisor's head. He was calm about all of it, systematic and unruffled, the way he was about everything. Letters began to arrive in Caldwell, from other families. 3 of them in a 10-day period, families who had experienced similar disputes with Voss and Prout, and who had read the newspaper story and now, emboldened, were willing to put their accounts in writing. Pauline spent 3 days writing responses and organizing their testimony into a document she titled, with the precision of a copyist who understood that language mattered, a report on the pattern of property fraud in Sumner County, Kansas, 1880-1882. She sent copies to the Topeka Daily Capital, to the regional supervisor of the General Land Office, and to the 2 senators who had previously sent her form letters. One of the senators wrote back. His name was Preston Plum, the junior senator from Kansas, and his letter was short but substantive. He had seen the Whitfield article. He was interested in the specific question of fraudulent boundary adjustments in the context of the Homestead Act. He would be raising the matter at his next opportunity with the General Land Office Commissioner in Washington. Pauline read this letter standing in the hallway of the boarding house and had to lean against the wall for a moment. Andrew found her there. He had come in from a day of field work and was carrying his equipment pack over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw her expression. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up. "Plum is serious," he said. "He's not someone who writes letters he doesn't mean." "I know," she said. "Pauline," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it, though neither said anything about it. "This is working." "It might be working," she said carefully. "It is working," he said, with the same steady certainty he brought to everything. She took the letter back from him and looked at it again. Her hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. Everything she had worked for since January was beginning to collect into something that looked, at least from a distance, like the shape of victory, and she found, to her surprise, that this was almost more difficult to manage than defeat would have been. Defeat she had prepared herself for. This she had only allowed herself to want. "I should write to Senator Plum tonight," she said. "You should eat something first," Andrew said. "Mrs. Cartwright made a roast." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that dark-eyed steadiness that she had come to understand was not impassivity but attention, the quality of someone who was completely present. "Yes," she said, "all right." They sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Cartwright and Mr. Aldous the schoolteacher, and ate beef roast and potatoes and drank strong black coffee. And for the first time since January, Pauline laughed at something. A story missed her. Aldous told about a student who had submitted a geography essay claiming that the Mississippi River flowed north because that was the direction that made the most sense to him personally. Andrew laughed too. It was a good laugh, warm and unguarded, and it made the crowded kitchen feel smaller in a comfortable way. After supper, when Mrs. Cartwright and Mr. Aldous had gone to the parlor, Andrew and Pauline remained at the table. She was writing her letter to Senator Plum. He was looking over his survey notes. The lamp burned between them, and outside the spring Kansas night was full of frogs from the creek 2 blocks over. "Can I ask you something?" Andrew said. "Yes," she said without looking up from her writing. "What will you do with the land if you get it back?" She did set down her pen then. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the way you think about something that you are afraid to want too clearly. "Farm it," she said, "the way my father did, wheat mostly. The river land is good for it. There's a stand of cottonwoods along the south boundary that I used to climb as a child." She paused. "I'll need to rebuild the farmhouse." Pruitt's men tore down the original structure. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. "I didn't know that." "Last fall," she said. "One of the neighboring families wrote to me about it." She picked up her pen again. "It doesn't matter. The land is what matters. The house can be rebuilt." She wrote for a while. He looked at his notes. The frogs sang outside. "You'll need help," he said. "With the rebuilding, it's a significant undertaking for one person." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm just saying," he said, and then he stopped. She looked up. There was something different in his expression. Not the professional steadiness she was used to, but something less guarded, something that she had only glimpsed in the moments between tasks, on the train ride back from Topeka, at supper just now. "I know what you're saying," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "Do you?" "I think so," she said. The lamp flickered between them. Outside, the Kansas night pressed warm and alive against the windows. "I'd like to help," he said. "Pass the case. Pass the survey work and the reports and the letters. I'd like to help." She thought about what she wanted to say and said it as honestly as she could. "I'd like that too," she said. "But I need to finish the case first. I need to do this myself. I need everyone who told me I couldn't be wrong about it on their own terms, not because a man made it possible." He nodded. He had understood this about her from very early, she could see. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to make it possible. You've already done that. I'm just telling you that after I'd like to be there." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, this stubborn, honest, careful man who had been the one person in Caldwell who had treated her work as real, her claim as legitimate, her mind as capable from the very first evening at this table. "After," she said, "then we'll talk." He nodded and went back to his survey notes. She went back to her letter. The frogs sang on. April arrived with warm winds and the smell of cut grass, and things began to move with an accelerating momentum that Pauline had not dared believe in during the long, cold months of February and March. Senator Plum did raise the question of Sumner County with the General Land Office Commissioner. The commissioner, a political appointee who had strong opinions about land fraud undermining settlement policy, dispatched a federal inspector to Caldwell. The federal inspector's name was Marcus Hale, and unlike everyone else in the official landscape who had received Pauline's letters, Marcus Hale was neither bought nor friendly with Gerald Prout. He arrived in Caldwell in the second week of April, and his first request was to review Pauline's documentation. She spent 4 hours with him at Mrs. Cartwright's kitchen table, walking him through everything: her father's original filing, the altered boundary survey, the payment receipt, the testimonies from the other families, Andrew's resurvey findings, the timeline of auctions and filings, and the pattern of procedural maneuvers Voss had used to shut down challenges. Hale asked precise, technical questions and wrote everything down. He did not once suggest that she was overreacting or mistaken, or that the process would be too complicated for her to understand. He treated her, in other words, exactly as Andrew had always treated her, as a competent person presenting evidence that deserved serious evaluation. At the end of the 4 hours, he gathered his notes and said, "Miss Bell, I'm going to need to interview several other individuals before I can issue a formal finding. But I want you to know, preliminary examination of these materials presents a very strong case for fraud." Pauline held herself very still. "How long will the formal process take?" "If everything proceeds as I expect," Hale said, "somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks. I can't move faster than the regulations allow." "I understand," she said. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Miss Bell, the work you've done here is extraordinary. Most people in your position, regardless of gender or circumstance, would not have been capable of building a case this thorough." "My father built something worth fighting for," she said. "That makes it easier." 6 weeks later, in the brutal heat of late May, with the Kansas sun turning everything white and the air tasting of dust and dry grass, Harlan Voss was formally suspended from his position as Sumner County Land Commissioner, pending the outcome of a federal fraud investigation. The suspension was announced in a letter from the General Land Office Commissioner that was read aloud by the county sheriff on the steps of the Land Office building. Pauline stood in the crowd and listened. She stood alone because she had wanted to stand alone for this part. She had done this. She needed to feel it as hers. The crowd's reaction was divided as she had expected. Several people applauded. Several others looked unhappy. A few men who had benefited from Voss's arrangement scowled. A woman she did not know reached through the crowd and briefly pressed Pauline's arm, and when Pauline looked at her, the woman just nodded. Prout's lawyers filed an emergency motion 3 days later, arguing that the investigation findings should not apply retroactively to completed transactions. The motion was reviewed in Wichita. It was denied. 2 weeks after that, at the end of June, a federal judge in Wichita issued a ruling invalidating the auction of the Bell homestead on the grounds that the original filing had been legitimate, the survey fee payment had been valid, and the county had failed to properly process the payment before proceeding with the auction. The 160 acres along the Cimarron River was returned, in law, to the estate of Clement Bell, and by extension to his surviving heir, Pauline Bell. Pauline received the news in the form of a telegram delivered to Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house on a hot Tuesday afternoon in late June. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the stairs and did something she had promised herself back in January she would not do. She cried. Mrs. Cartwright found her there and sat down beside her on the stairs and put one large, solid arm around her shoulders and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. Andrew found her later, when she had composed herself and come into the kitchen to read the telegram a third time. He came in from a day of field work, carrying his equipment pack and trail dust, and stopped when he saw her face. "It came through," he said. It was not a question. He could read her face well enough by now. "The ruling came this morning," she said. "The land is mine." He set his pack down. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and before she had quite registered what was happening, he had her hands in both of his and was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his steady face before, open and warm and without any of the careful professional composure she had grown accustomed to. "Pauline," he said, "you did it." "We did it," she said. "No," he said. "I helped. You did it." She looked at their joined hands. His were large and calloused from 6 years of field work, and hers were ink-stained from months of writing and copying. She thought of all the kitchen table evenings and the train ride to Topeka and the federal inspector and the long cold months of letters and waiting, and she thought about what he had said to her on that first evening, because it's wrong and because someone ought to. She thought about how he had been there through every single piece of it, steady and honest and believing in her even in the weeks when she had had trouble believing in herself. "I love you," she said. The words arrived without plan or preamble. They were simply true, and she had learned a long time ago that the truest things tended to announce themselves without waiting for the polished moment. He went very still. Then his hands tightened around hers. "I've been in love with you," he said, "since sometime around February, the evening you cited the land office regulations from memory to silence Otis the clerk. It was extremely specific, and I can pinpoint it exactly." She laughed. "It came out a little ragged from the crying earlier, but it was real." "That's the least romantic thing I've ever heard," she said. "I disagree," he said. "I think a woman citing land office regulations from memory is one of the most romantic things there is." "You're a surveyor," she said. "Your idea of romance is probably shaped by boundary lines." "And fence posts," he agreed. He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat, steady as everything else about him. And then he leaned forward and kissed her, which she had not entirely expected and which was, she discovered, exactly as straightforward and warm and honest as she had somehow known it would be. When he pulled back, the late June light was pouring through the kitchen windows and making everything golden. "Come to the land with me," she said. "I want to see it. Right now." He said, "Right now," she said. They rode out to the Cimarron River parcel that same afternoon on 2 horses borrowed from the livery stable, and the prairie rolled out around them golden and enormous under the summer sky. The grass was tall and seed-heavy, and it moved like water in the south wind that came up in the late afternoon. The river, when they reached it, was low for June but clear, running over a bed of pale stones, and the cottonwoods along the south boundary were in full leaf, their flat leaves turning in the breeze with the particular silver-green shimmer that Pauline had remembered from childhood, and that was exactly, precisely, perfectly as she remembered it. She stopped her horse at the edge of the field and looked at the land for a long time without speaking. The farmhouse Prout's men had torn down was gone, just a foundation and some scattered timber. The wheat field her father had cultivated had gone wild, grass and wildflowers growing through the old furrows, but the land was there. The river was there. The cottonwoods were there. The hill above the river where Thomas was buried was there, marked with a flat stone she could see from where she sat. Andrew stopped his horse beside hers and did not say anything. He understood that there were moments that required silence. After a while she said, "My father used to say that good land is patient, that it waits for the people who belong to it." "Smart man," Andrew said. "He was," she said. "You would have liked him." "I think I would have," Andrew said, "and I think he would have liked me." "He would have had strong opinions about your ironing," she said. Andrew smiled. "Everyone does." She looked at him, this man on a borrowed horse in a summer field beside a river in Kansas, this man who had been the one person in the whole enterprise who had seen her clearly from the beginning and had not looked away. "I'm going to need help building the house," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm also going to need a surveyor to confirm the boundary markers are correctly placed before I file the new deed." "Naturally," he said. "And I'm going to need someone willing to live on a wheat farm along the Cimarron River in Sumner County, Kansas," she said. He met her eyes. "That sounds like a job with considerable long-term prospects," he said. "It has a good future," she agreed. "But it's hard work. The land needs attention. The house needs to be built from nothing. It's not an easy life." "No," he said, "but it's a right one." She reached across the space between their horses and held out her hand, not the hand of a woman being rescued, but the hand of a person who had built something worth sharing and was now choosing who to share it with. He took it. They rode back to Caldwell with the sun going down behind them, turning the prairie orange and purple, and that deep burning gold that the Kansas sky specialized in at the end of summer days. The months that followed were, in Pauline's assessment, the most demanding and most rewarding of her life, and they were frequently both of those things at the same time. She filed the new property deed herself at the Sumner County Land Records Office in early July, with a new county land commissioner who had been appointed pending Voss's trial. Otis, the nervous clerk, was there, and he processed her paperwork without a single procedural objection, with something that might have been relief on his pale, anxious face. She hired 2 local carpenters to begin the work on the farmhouse, but she was there every day, making decisions about the design and the dimensions and the placement, because it was her house, and she was going to know every board of it. Andrew was there most days too, officially because his land office duties kept him in the Caldwell area, unofficially because he had established a pattern of being wherever she was that neither of them had formally discussed, but both of them had clearly settled into. He was extraordinarily useful with the construction, as it turned out, not just because of his familiarity with site surveys and structural measurements, but because he had grown up helping his father build things. He could look at a wall going up and identify a problem in the framing before anyone else saw it. He could read the land around the foundation and say, "The drainage needs to be shifted 10 yards east or you'll have flooding in a wet spring," and he was right. The house went up through July and August, a solid timber frame structure with 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft, a covered porch facing the river, and a kitchen with south-facing windows that Pauline designed herself to catch the winter light. She planted a kitchen garden in a protected spot near the eastern wall. She repaired the fencing around the field where the old wheat furrows were. She borrowed a horse and a plow from a neighboring farmer named Gus Henriksen, who had been a friend of her father's, and who brought his wife over on the first Sunday in August with a jar of pickled vegetables and a handshake, and the information that he had always known Clement Bell's land claim was legitimate, and he was glad to see justice done. Harlan Voss's trial was held in Wichita in September of 1882. Pauline was called as a witness. She traveled to Wichita on the train and sat in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and summer heat, and answered every question the prosecutor asked with the same flat, clear precision she had brought to every other part of this fight. She was cross-examined by Pruitt's lawyer, a clever man from Kansas City named Whitmore, who tried several times to suggest that her documents might have been assembled fraudulently, or that her understanding of land law was incomplete. She dismantled each suggestion with specific citations and dates, and the quiet, controlled certainty of a woman who had spent 8 months living inside this case. At one point, the judge leaned forward to follow a technical point she was making, and the court reporter had to ask her to slow down. Andrew testified, too, on the survey findings. He was precise, methodical, and completely unrattled by Whitmore's cross-examination. Voss was convicted on 3 counts of land fraud in late September. He was sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary. Gerald Pruitt, whose lawyers were better and whose connection to Voss was somewhat more indirect, escaped criminal conviction, but was subject to civil action by the 3 other families whose land had been taken through Voss's schemes. He settled those cases out of court in the winter of 1882, and the word in Caldwell was that the settlements had cost him considerably. Pauline, for her part, felt no particular triumph about the trial. The conviction was correct. The sentence was correct. But it did not bring back the years of fighting, or her father, or Thomas buried on the hill. It was justice in the limited, imperfect way that justice usually came, better than nothing, not as much as it should have been, and carrying on. She had a wheat field to plant. She stayed at the farmhouse through September, then went back to Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house for the nights as the autumn cold set in, and the farmhouse was not yet fully insulated. Andrew stayed in his room at the boarding house, and they met every morning for coffee before work and every evening for supper. And Mrs. Cartwright watched all of this with the impassive satisfaction of a woman whose opinion had already been formed before anyone asked it. On a cool October evening, when the house was nearly finished and the south windows were in, and the smell of fresh timber and pine pitch filled every room, Andrew and Pauline stood on the covered porch and watched the sun go down over the Cimarron River. The cottonwoods had gone gold. The prairie grass was tawny and ripe. A flight of geese crossed the sky in a ragged V heading south. "I want to ask you something," Andrew said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a plain gold band set with a small garnet, not elaborate, not pretentious. "I should have done this with more ceremony, I know that. Mrs. Cartwright told me I should have flowers and a better coat. I have one of those things." "You have a better coat," she said. He did. It was new. "I bought it specifically," he said. "Pauline, I love you. You are the most determined, capable, honest person I have ever known. I want to stand beside you on this land for the rest of my life and watch you grow everything you're going to grow. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and at his steady brown eyes, and at the farmhouse behind her that she had fought for and built and was going to fill with the rest of her life. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger. Then he kissed her on the porch of the house above the Cimarron River with the cottonwoods going gold behind them and the October sky enormous and clear overhead. And it was not theatrical or composed or careful. It was just entirely real. They were married in the first week of November, 1882, in Caldwell, in a simple ceremony at the small Methodist church on the main street that Mrs. Cartwright attended every Sunday and had quietly arranged access to. Mrs. Cartwright stood up for Pauline. James Whitfield, the reporter, had made the trip from Topeka and stood up for Andrew along with Gus Henriksen, the neighboring farmer, who wore his Sunday suit and sat in the front pew with his wife and cried quietly from the beginning of the ceremony without apparent embarrassment. Pauline wore the dark navy dress, the same one she had worn to Topeka, because it was the best one she owned, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Andrew wore the new coat and had pressed his trousers without help, and the result was considerably better than anything she had seen him produce with a flat iron before. She told him this after the ceremony, and he accepted the compliment with dignity. Mr. Aldous, the schoolteacher, played the church's small organ surprisingly well. The sun came through the south windows and lit the whole small room amber. When it was done, when they had signed the register and turned to face a church full of people who were genuinely pleased for them, Pauline felt something she could only describe as arrival. Not the triumphant, trumpet fanfare variety of arrival she had imagined during the darkest months of the fight. Something quieter. Something that felt like putting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its presence, and finding that without it, she was lighter than she had known she could be. They moved into the farmhouse the following week. Andrew submitted his resignation to the General Land Office District Office in Wichita, with a letter that outlined his objections to the supervisory conduct that had allowed the Sumner County fraud to continue unchallenged, and which was, Pauline read when he showed it to her, meticulously polite and utterly devastating in its specific accuracy. His supervisor wrote back a letter of acceptance that was 2 lines long. Andrew did not appear to be troubled by this. "What will you do now?" Pauline asked. "For work." "There are independent survey contracts available," he said. "Private landowners, railroad companies, municipal development, the railroads especially are expanding through this part of Kansas. I can do the same work without the department politics." "And here," she said, "on the farm." "I'll do what needs doing," he said. "I grew up on a farm, I know how." He did know how. He was good with the animals, practical and patient. He was useful in the field. He built an addition to the equipment shed in December that was better constructed than the original. He was not a man who made a performance of work, which Pauline respected deeply, having encountered a great deal of the performative variety in her life. They planted winter wheat in November, a smaller crop than the land could eventually support, because they were also building and preparing and learning the particular rhythms of this specific piece of ground. They planted it together, side by side in the cold November fields, and the work was hard and physical and real. And Pauline thought about her father walking these same fields, putting the same seed into the same earth, and she felt, across all the years, a thread of continuity that she had been afraid she might lose forever. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but manageable. They had enough firewood, enough food, and each other, which was more than enough. The farmhouse was warm and solidly built, and on the evenings when the wind came hard across the prairie and rattled the windows, they sat by the fire with books and coffee, and the quiet comfort of two people who have chosen correctly and know it. They had their arguments. They were both strong-willed and direct and accustomed to being right. Their disagreements tended to be specific, about practical matters, where to shift the south fence line, how to manage the spring planting schedule, whether to accept a particular survey contract Andrew had been offered that would take him away from the farm for 2 weeks. They argued clearly and honestly and reached resolutions that usually incorporated something from both positions. Once in February they had a larger argument about money, about whether to take out a loan to expand the wheat planting in the spring or proceed cautiously with what they had. Pauline wanted to expand. Andrew wanted to wait. "I know you want to build it fast," Andrew said. "I understand why. But if we push too hard before the first harvest proves out, we're taking a risk we don't need to take." "The land is good," Pauline said. "My father grew successful wheat here for 15 years. Your father also had 15 years of experience on this specific piece of ground," Andrew said. "We have 1 season. I'm not arguing with your judgment about the land. I'm arguing about the timing." She thought about this for a long while and concluded, privately, that he was right, and told him so the next morning, and he accepted this without triumph, just with a simple nod and a return to the practical question of spring planting. The spring wheat they did plant came in well. The first real harvest in the summer of 1883 was not enormous, but it was solid, enough to cover their costs and put some aside and justify the loan for the following year's expanded planting. Gus Henriksen brought his thresher over, and they worked the fields together for 3 days in the August heat, and at the end of it they sat on the farmhouse porch and drank cold well water and watched the evening come, and Gus said it was the best wheat he had seen from that land since Clement Bell was farming it. Pauline took this as the highest possible compliment. In September of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Andrew on a Sunday morning when the harvest was done and the fields were lying fallow in the clean September light. She told him at the kitchen table over coffee directly as she told him everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" he asked. "I feel entirely well," she said. "Surprised, but well." He smiled then, the full, warm smile that still surprised her with its capacity to change his face entirely. "Good," he said. "That's good." He was, over the months that followed, attentive without being overbearing, concerned without being anxious, helpful in the practical ways that were his native language. He adjusted the farm chores so that she was not doing anything heavy in the late months. He rode to Caldwell for the doctor when her back ached badly in January. He sat up with her through the long February nights when the cold was sharp, and the baby was active and sleep was difficult. And he read to her from the farming almanac, and from a collection of geological surveys he had brought from his surveying days, and she fell asleep to the sound of his voice, describing the mineral composition of the Kansas river-bottom soil with exactly the same quality of care as if it were the finest literature in the world. Their son was born in March of 1884, a large, loud, extremely opinionated infant who arrived on a Sunday morning, while a late winter snow was falling softly outside the farmhouse windows. The doctor from Caldwell was there. Mrs. Cartwright, who had come to stay for a week in anticipation of the event, was there. Andrew was there, holding Pauline's hand through the whole of it, not flinching, not looking away, present in the complete and total way he was present at everything that mattered. When it was over, when the doctor had handed him the wrapped, squalling baby, Andrew stood with his son in his arms and looked at Pauline with an expression that she could not fully describe afterward, except to say that it was the most open thing she had ever seen on a human face. "What do we call him?" Andrew asked. "Clement," Pauline said. "For my father." Andrew looked at the baby. "Clement Dawson," he said. "Hello." The baby grabbed his thumb and held it with the astonishing grip of the newly arrived and did not let go. Mrs. Cartwright, from the doorway, made a sound that was clearly a suppressed sob and said, entirely unconvincingly, "There's something in my eye." The snow fell softly outside. The fire burned in the hearth. The Cimarron River ran below the cottonwoods in the pale March light. Life on the Bell farm, which everyone in the county still called the Bell farm, and which Pauline had chosen to keep as the Bell homestead even after marriage as her father's memorial, developed its own full rhythms over the years that followed. Andrew built his independent survey practice into a respected business, working primarily for private landowners, and occasionally for the Santa Fe Railroad as it expanded through southern Kansas. He was known throughout the county as a man whose survey work could be trusted completely, which was a reputation that took years to build, and that he protected with the same stubborn integrity he brought to everything. The farm expanded carefully over time, as Pauline had always intended. She was a good farmer. She had her father's instinct for the land and her own trained eye for problems before they became disasters. She negotiated her own contracts with the wheat buyers in Caldwell and later in Wichita, and she was the person who handled the business of the farm with the same precision she had brought to the legal case in 1882. Several of the buyers in those early years attempted to work through Andrew rather than with her directly. She corrected this misunderstanding with cheerful firmness on each occasion, and by 1885 it had stopped happening. James Whitfield visited from Topeka in the summer of 1884 and stayed for a weekend, and they sat on the farmhouse porch in the evening and watched Clement attempt to eat grass, while Whitfield told them that his articles on Sumner County land fraud had contributed to 2 additional investigations in neighboring counties. He had been offered a position at a larger newspaper in St. Louis. "Are you taking it?" Andrew asked. "I'm considering it," Whitfield said. "St. Louis has its attractions, but Kansas has better sky." "That's true," Andrew said. Whitfield looked at the farm, at the wheat fields gold in the summer evening, at the cottonwoods silvering along the river, at Pauline holding the baby on her hip, and talking easily about the harvest yields with the confidence of someone in complete command of her subject. "You know," he said to Andrew quietly, "when I first heard about this case, I thought it would be a small story. Local fraud, one displaced settler, the usual pattern. I didn't expect," he paused, watching Pauline make Clement laugh by putting a piece of straw in his mouth and then removing it suddenly, "all of this." "No," Andrew said. "Neither did I. What made you get involved in the first place?" Whitfield asked. "You had a comfortable enough position. The complaint you'd filed had already been ignored. You could have let it go." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "Because she wasn't going to let it go," he said, "and she was right not to, and somebody needed to be useful." Whitfield wrote that down. He was a reporter even on vacation. The autumn of 1885 brought a second pregnancy, and a harder winter, and some genuine anxiety about the wheat market, which had been volatile. They were not in danger, the farm was sound, but the margins were tighter than Pauline liked. She spent 3 months working through the accounts in the kitchen at night, rearranging and planning, and found a path through that required selling 2 of the draft horses and switching part of the east field to sorghum, which had a better guaranteed price that year through the Caldwell grain merchants. Andrew deferred to her completely on the farm finances. He understood them, but he understood that she understood them better, and he respected this without ego. Their second child, a daughter, was born in April of 1886. They named her Frances, after Andrew's mother, who had died before he moved to Kansas, and whom he spoke of rarely but with careful affection. Frances arrived in a warmer month and with considerably less drama than Clement had, a small, fierce, dark-eyed person who looked immediately like Andrew and had, from the very beginning, his quality of watchful, measured attention. Clement, at 2 years old, was a large, boisterous, wheat-blonde child who had Pauline's stubbornness and Andrew's thoroughness, and was already attempting to follow his father around the equipment shed with a child-sized interest in how things worked. Mrs. Cartwright came for the birth and stayed 3 weeks and was, by now, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of their lives that she had her own room in the farmhouse extension. Andrew had built and kept a change of clothes there permanently. "You're essentially her grandmother," Pauline told Andrew one evening. "Mrs. Cartwright is essentially everybody's grandmother," Andrew said. "I think she prefers it that way." The legal aftermath of the Voss case continued to ripple through the county in ways that Pauline monitored with careful attention. 2 of the 3 families who had given testimony recovered portions of their disputed land through civil action. The 3rd family, the Murtaugh family, whose case was more complicated because their original filing had a genuine clerical error that Voss had exploited rather than manufactured, received a settlement from the county that was less than what they deserved but more than nothing. Pauline wrote to the Murtaugh family when the settlement was announced, a personal letter rather than an official one, acknowledging the injustice of the outcome and telling them what she genuinely believed, that the system had failed them in the way the system frequently failed people who lacked the particular combination of resources, timing, and bloody-minded persistence that she happened to have had. She received a letter back from Margaret Murtaugh, a woman of 50 who had homesteaded with her husband for 18 years, that said simply, "Thank you for fighting when you could. It matters that someone did." Pauline kept that letter in the kitchen drawer under the farm accounts. By 1887, the Bell homestead along the Cimarron River was a working, prosperous farm in the fullest and most honest sense. The wheat fields covered most of the original 160 acres. There was a vegetable garden and an orchard of young apple trees that would take another decade to mature, but that Pauline planted anyway because she intended to be there in a decade. The farmhouse had been extended twice, once for the children's room and once for the office where Pauline kept the farm accounts, and Andrew kept his survey equipment, and clients sometimes met them on the covered porch overlooking the river. Clement started school in Caldwell in the fall of 1887, riding a small pony named Dollar that was so calm and well-mannered that he could have been trusted to make the trip alone, which they did not allow because he was 3.5. Andrew rode with him for the first month. After that, he rode with the Henriksen children from the neighboring farm, who were older and reliable. The school in Caldwell had a new teacher that year, a young woman named Miss Graves, who was 22 and had come from Ohio and was nervous about the West, but had taken the position because she wanted to teach, and this was the position available. Pauline met her at the school's opening day and liked her immediately, recognizing in her the particular combination of determination and anxiety that she herself had carried into Caldwell 5 years earlier. She invited Miss Graves to supper at the farm the following Sunday, and after supper, when Andrew and Clement were outside looking at something in the equipment shed and Frances was asleep, she told Miss Graves, quietly and without drama, that the West was harder than anyone told you it would be and better than anyone told you it would be, and that the key to both of those things was finding the right people to work alongside. Miss Graves nodded and looked out the kitchen window at the Cimarron River in the October evening. "How did you find them?" she asked. "The right people." "Honestly," Pauline said, The first right person found me. He was sitting at this table the first evening I arrived. Miss Graves smiled. You were lucky. Yes, Pauline said, and I worked very hard. Both things are true. The winter of 1887 was harsh, the harshest they had experienced on the farm, and it tested everything. The wheat was dormant and safe under the snow, but the cold went deep into January and the coal ran short, and two of the animals needed veterinary attention that cost more than they had budgeted. Andrew took on 2 emergency survey contracts in January and February that required him to be away from the farm for several days each time, riding out in temperatures that were genuinely dangerous. Pauline managed the farm in his absence with Gus Henrikson's help and her own considerable capability, and when Andrew came back from the second contract in late February, cold through to the bone and exhausted, she met him in the barn where he was seeing to his horse, and she held his face in her warm hands and said, I need you to never do that again. The money isn't worth it. I know, he said. He leaned his forehead against hers. I was trying to. I know what you were trying to do, she said. We have savings. We have the accounts. We're fine. I need you here more than I need the extra $100 from the Caldwell Railroad contract in February. He was quiet for a moment in the cold barn, with the horses shifting around them. All right, he said. Good, she said. She kissed him in the cold barn and they went inside together. Spring came after the harsh winter with a particular intensity, as if making up for the months of cold. The wheat came up strong and early. The apple trees in the orchard bloomed. Frances learned to walk in April, careening around the farmhouse with the focused purpose of someone who had important destinations in mind. Clement, now 4, appointed himself her supervisor and took the role with tremendous seriousness. In the summer of 1888, something happened that Pauline had not anticipated. James Whitfield wrote from St. Louis, where he had gone with the newspaper position the previous year, with a proposition. He had been working on a longer piece, a book-length account of land fraud and the Homestead Act and the specific story of Sumner County, for a publisher in Chicago. He wanted to use Pauline's case as the central narrative. He wanted to interview both of them at length. He was proposing a 3-day visit to the farm in September. Pauline read the letter twice. Then she read it to Andrew over supper. Andrew listened all the way through and then said, What do you want to do? I want to think about it, she said. She thought about it for a week. She thought about what it would mean to have the story told in a book, permanently, in a form that could not be taken back. She thought about whether it would be, as she suspected Whitfield intended, genuinely useful for the broader question of how land fraud operated under the Homestead Act. She thought about the Murdoch family and Margaret Murdoch's letter in the kitchen drawer. She wrote to Whitfield and said yes. He came in September. He stayed 3 days and filled 6 notebooks. He talked to Pauline for hours about every aspect of the case. He talked to Andrew about the survey findings and the professional consequences of speaking out. He talked to Mrs. Cartwright, who was visiting that week, and who gave a comprehensive and entirely uncompromising account of the Caldwell community's response to Pauline's arrival in 1882. On the last evening, Whitfield sat on the farmhouse porch with a glass of Mrs. Cartwright's preserved cherry wine and looked at the Cimarron River in the September dark. "Can I ask you both something?" he said. They were sitting on the porch, Andrew in the chair near the door, Pauline on the bench, Frances asleep inside, and Clement just put to bed. "Go ahead," Pauline said. "When it was hardest," Whitfield said, "when it looked like Voss was going to win and the auction had already happened and the land office wasn't responding, what kept you going?" They both were quiet for a moment. "I didn't know how to stop," Pauline said finally. "It's not a romantic answer, but it's true. I had come so far and invested so much, and there was no logical point at which giving up made more sense than continuing. The only thing that was going to make me stop was running out of resources or dying, and I still had resources." "That's one answer," Whitfield said. He looked at Andrew. "And you had the most to lose professionally." Andrew was quiet for a long moment. "She was right," he said. "That's the whole answer. She was right and I knew it, and I had the specific skills to help prove it. There wasn't a serious choice involved. When you know something is right and you have the capacity to act on it, not acting on it is its own kind of decision. I didn't want to make that one. Whitfield wrote in his notebook. One more question, he said, for both of you. What does the farm mean now, after all of it? Pauline looked out at the dark river. The cottonwoods were invisible in the dark, but she knew where they were. She knew every feature of this land now, as well as she knew the inside of the farmhouse better, perhaps because she had learned it by walking it in every season and every weather. My father spent 20 years making this land into something, she said. He thought it would be lost. I spent a year making sure it wasn't. Andrew and I have spent 6 years building on what he made. She paused. It means everything he worked for wasn't wasted. That's what it means. Andrew reached across from his chair and put his hand over hers on the bench. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Whitfield's book was published in the spring of 1890. It was called Surveyors and Settlers, Land Fraud and the American Homestead, and it received serious reviews in Chicago and New York and Topeka, and sold well enough to matter. Several people wrote to Pauline after reading it, landowners in similar disputes in other states, families who had faced similar fraudulent schemes. She answered every letter. Senator Plum cited the book in a speech on the floor of the Senate in the fall of 1890 in support of stronger protections against land fraud under the Homestead Act. He sent Pauline a copy of the Congressional Record with the relevant section marked. She framed it and put it in the office with the survey maps and the farm accounts. The 1880s turned into the 1890s, and the Bell homestead turned into the kind of place that had been there long enough to feel permanent, which was what permanence really meant, not the absence of struggle, but the accumulation of time and work and seasons. The apple orchard matured. The wheat production stabilized at a reliable, profitable level. The farmhouse was solid and warm and full of the accumulated evidence of a life being lived. Books stacked beside lamps, survey maps and account ledgers side by side on the office shelf, children's drawings fixed to the kitchen wall. Clement grew into a serious, sturdy boy who had Pauline's determination and Andrew's patience, which was a particularly effective combination. By the time he was 10, he knew how to assist with surveying measurements and was interested in following his father into the work, a possibility that Andrew was careful not to push toward and equally careful to keep available. Frances, at 7, had decided she wanted to be a doctor. This decision had arrived fully formed after she had observed the Caldwell doctor treating Gus Henriksen for a broken wrist, and had spent a week asking questions about anatomy that neither of her parents could fully answer. Pauline took this seriously and ordered 2 medical texts from a bookseller in Wichita. They arrived in the spring and Frances read them with a focus that was entirely recognizable to everyone who knew her parents. In the spring of 1892, the 10th anniversary of Pauline's arrival in Caldwell on that January train in the snowstorm, Pauline woke up early on a March morning and stood at the kitchen window while the coffee heated on the stove and watched the sun come up over the Cimarron River. The cottonwoods were bare still, just the black filigree of branches against the pale sky, but there were buds beginning, the barely visible thickening that happened before the leaves came, the land getting ready. Andrew came downstairs and found her standing there. He was still in his shirt and suspenders, dark hair going gray at the temples now, and he stood behind her and put his arms around her and looked out the window with her at the river and the budding cottonwoods and the fields beginning to green at the edges. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. I came here to prove everyone wrong, she said. Everyone who told me I couldn't do it. That I was a woman alone and the West would swallow me. I wanted to shove the proof in their faces. And did you? He said. Yes, she said. But that's the funny thing. That stopped mattering somewhere along the way. It stopped being about them. What did it become about? He said. She looked out at the land, her father's land, her land, their land. The field she had fought for, and the house she had built and the orchard she had planted, and the river running over pale stones the way it had always run, and the hill above it where Thomas was buried in ground she would never let anyone take away. "This," she said, "just this." He tightened his arms around her and pressed a kiss to her hair, and they stood at the kitchen window together while the coffee heated, and the Kansas morning opened up, wide and clear and full of everything that had been built and was still being built. The particular kind of abundance that comes not from luck but from staying, from refusing to let go, from finding the one person who stands beside you and roots for you to win, and then winning together, which is the only kind of winning that truly counts. The third child, a boy they named Thomas James Dawson, after Pauline's brother and after Whitfield, who was the boy's godfather and drove from Topeka for the christening, and cried more openly than he had at anything in his professional life, was born in November of 1892, a healthy, noisy arrival into a house that was ready for him. Mrs. Cartwright was there. She was 73 now, slower on her feet but completely undimmed in her opinions, and she held Thomas James on her first morning of life and said, "He looks like Clement Bell," and then looked at Pauline with the quiet understanding of a woman who had watched the whole story from the beginning and knew what that meant. "He does a little," Pauline said. "The land keeps producing," Mrs. Cartwright said. "That's what land does when you tend it right." The county had changed over the decade. Caldwell had grown, the railroad bringing commerce and settlers and the complicated mix of progress and disruption that characterized the West in the 1880s and 1890s. There were more farms, more organized county services, a proper school building where Miss Graves still taught, now married to the Caldwell pharmacist and the mother of two. The worst of the old corruption had been cleaned out by the federal investigation and the political pressure of the Whitfield articles and the Plum speech, though Pauline was not naive enough to think corruption had been eliminated, only reorganized. She sat on the county agricultural board beginning in 1893, the first woman to hold that position, appointed by the new county commissioner who had read Whitfield's book and knew her reputation. She brought to the role the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and her particular expertise in land rights made her genuinely useful in the disputes and negotiations that were the board's regular business. Andrew completed the survey of the eastern Sumner County land holdings that had been commissioned by the county in 1894, a major project that took 18 months, and produced the most comprehensive and accurate land record the county had had since settlement. It became the definitive reference document for property disputes in the county for the next 20 years. Clement, at 16, announced that he would like to study law. He had been reading Pauline's old law references from her Cincinnati days and had developed a very specific interest in property and land law. Andrew looked at Pauline across the supper table when Clement said this, and Pauline looked back at Andrew, and both of them had the expression of people who had seen something coming for years. "We'll find you a good school," Pauline said. "Topeka has a good one," Andrew said. "Or Kansas City, we can look at both." Frances, 12, said from her end of the table, "When I go to school, I'm going to Philadelphia." "The Jefferson Medical College accepts women now," Pauline said. "It's a good school." Frances nodded with the satisfied air of someone who has confirmed a plan they already had. Thomas James, too, dropped his spoon on the floor and looked at it with the focused philosophical attention that he brought to most unexpected events. Andrew picked it up and handed it back. Thomas James dropped it again immediately and looked at his father expectantly. "He's testing a theory," Andrew said seriously, "about repetition and outcomes." "He is too," Pauline said. "He's thorough," Andrew said. "Gets it from his mother." Pauline threw her napkin at him. He caught it without looking up from the dropped spoon situation, which was either a very practiced reflex or extraordinary peripheral vision, and either way was impressive. The evenings on the farmhouse porch became, over the years, one of the central rituals of their life together. In summer, they sat outside after supper when the children were in bed, and they watched the river and the stars and talked about the farm and the work and the wider world that reached them through newspapers and letters and the occasional visitor. They argued sometimes, constructively, about politics and farming methods and the best response to various practical dilemmas. They were quiet together sometimes, comfortable in the way that people are comfortable when they have spent enough years learning each other's silences. Andrew told her things on those evenings that he had never told anyone else, about his father and the lost Illinois farm, about the years of fieldwork before Caldwell when he had been genuinely lonely, about the things he had seen in the West that he had wanted to fix and had not always been able to. She told him things, too, about the loneliness of Cincinnati after her mother died, about the years of pretending to be someone she was not in order to hold jobs she was qualified for, about the particular fear she had not admitted to anyone in 1882, that she would fail and everyone who had told her she would be wrong would be confirmed. "Were you afraid?" he asked her once. It was a summer evening in 1895, and Clement was 15 and Frances was 11 and Thomas James was 3, and all of them were asleep, and the river was low and quiet below the cottonwoods. "Every single day," she said. "I was afraid every day from January until June in 1882. "You never showed it," he said. "I know," she said. "I couldn't afford to. If I showed it, people would use it as evidence that I shouldn't be there." "I knew," he said. She looked at him. "I could tell," he said. "Not because you showed weakness, just because I was paying attention. You were the most frightened, brave person I had ever seen. It made me want to help you more, not less." She thought about this for a while. "That's different from what most people would have done," she said. "Most people conflate fear with incapacity," he said. "I don't. Fear is just information about what matters." She reached over and took his hand in the warm dark. "When did you know you loved me?" she asked. "The real moment, not the regulation citation moment." He thought about it. "The evening in the kitchen when you said you were running out of money," he said. "You said it so flatly and honestly. No performance, no apology, just a fact that needed to be part of the plan. I thought, this is an extraordinary person." He paused. "The feelings had been building before that. That was the moment I knew them for what they were. The moment I said I was broke," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is genuinely the most specific love story I have ever heard," she said. "I'm a very specific person," he said. She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and they stayed on the porch until the stars were full overhead and the prairie night hummed with crickets, and the river ran below the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the farmhouse behind them, 3 children slept in the rooms of a house that had been built on land that had been fought for, on a piece of Kansas earth that had survived fraud and winter and drought and was producing still, as good land does, faithfully and without drama, season after season after season. The years settled and built themselves into a life that was larger than either of them had imagined that first winter in Mrs. Cartwright's boarding house. Clement left for the law school in Topeka in 1899, the same year Frances began preparing seriously for the medical school applications she intended to submit in 2 years. Thomas James grew into a curious, gentle boy who loved the farm with an uncomplicated wholeness that neither of his older siblings had quite matched, and who announced at 11 that he intended to stay on the land and farm it, which made Pauline quietly and completely happy. When Mrs. Cartwright died in the winter of 1900, at the age of 79, peacefully in her own boarding house in Caldwell with her regular boarders around her, Pauline sat with her in the last days and held her hand, and said all the things that mattered about what she had meant: the shotgun at the door and the coffee on that first night and the arm around the shoulders on the stairs. Mrs. Cartwright listened with her eyes closed and squeezed Pauline's hand once, firmly, in acknowledgement. They buried her in the Caldwell cemetery on a January day that was gray and cold with a fine snow falling, and Pauline cried without apology, and Andrew stood beside her with his arm around her and did not tell her to be strong. Gus Henriksen was there. Mr. Aldous was there, retired now and moving slowly. Miss Graves, now Mrs. Fielding, was there with her husband. A dozen of Mrs. Cartwright's current and former boarders were there. The county commissioner was there. The new county land commissioner, a young man named Henry Price who had studied Whitfield's book in school, was there. The town had come, in its way, to pay respect to a woman who had made herself the stubborn, permanent center of something worth being the center of. Walking back from the cemetery, Andrew said, "She was the best landlady I ever had." "You only ever had the one," Pauline said. "That's why I have nothing to compare her to and can speak without qualification," he said. She took his arm and they walked through the January snow back toward the livery stable where they had left the horses. And even in the grief, there was the familiar warmth of being with the right person, the warmth that had been there since the kitchen table in 1882, and that had not diminished but grown, as warmth does when it is properly tended. Clement graduated from law school in 1903 and joined a firm in Topeka that specialized in property law. His first major case was a land dispute in Riley County, with a pattern almost identical to the one his mother had fought 20 years earlier. He wrote Pauline a long letter detailing the case, and she wrote back with specific notes about strategy and documentation that his supervising attorney later called some of the most astute procedural advice he had received on a property case. Frances received her medical degree from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1905. She returned to Kansas and set up a practice in Wichita, the first woman physician in practice in that city, which presented predictable challenges that she met with entirely predictable determination. Thomas James, at 17, was already managing significant portions of the farm alongside Andrew, who was 62 and still physically capable, but who appreciated the partnership with his youngest son more than he let on, which meant very much, because he let things on fairly often. In the summer of 1905, on a warm June evening when the wheat was ripening and the river was full from the spring rains, and the apple orchard was heavy with young fruit, Pauline and Andrew sat on the farmhouse porch at the end of a long day and watched the sun go down over the Cimarron River for the 23rd summer in a row from this specific porch. The land was golden in the evening light. The cottonwoods were full and green. The farmhouse behind them was solid and warm, built to last, which it had been and would continue to be. In the kitchen, the supper dishes were done. Thomas James had ridden over to the Henriksen farm, old Gus's son's farm now. In Topeka, Clement was preparing his case. In Wichita, Frances was seeing evening patients. "I want to tell you something," Pauline said. Andrew looked at her. His hair was more gray than dark now, and there were lines around his eyes from 20 years of Kansas sun, and he was entirely himself, the same steady, careful, honest man who had been sitting at a kitchen table reading a survey map when she walked in from the cold in January of 1882. "Everything I came here for," she said. "Every reason I got on that train in Cincinnati, proving people wrong, getting the land back, doing it myself, all of it." She paused. "I got all of it. But that's not what I think about when I think about coming west." "What do you think about?" he said. "That table," she said, "that first evening. You put the map down and stood up and shook my hand and looked at me like I was a person with something to say. That's what I think about." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I think about too," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The river caught the last of the sun and threw it back at the sky, bright and brief and real. The prairie rolled away in every direction, enormous and patient and alive, and above it, the Kansas sky went from orange to red to that deep, clear blue that you only find at the end of summer days, vast and indifferent to everything and beautiful for exactly that reason. The wheat moved in the evening wind. The cottonwoods turned their silver leaves. The river ran over its pale stones. And on the porch of the farmhouse along the Cimarron River in Sumner County, Kansas, in the summer of 1905, two people who had been given every reason to walk away from each other, and from the hardest things they had ever attempted, sat together in the honest dark of a life they had built without compromise. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything.